She traded her military boots for work gloves and thought she'd found peace in the quiet of inherited land, until a storm loosened stone revealed a cache that would make Pancho Villa's ghost smile and change everything she thought she knew about. Legacy. The treasure wasn't just gold and silver. It was a choice between honoring the past and securing a future she never imagined possible. Some secrets wait a century to find the right person to uncover them. The Texas sun hung low over the Rio Grande, casting long shadows across the weathered fence posts that marked the border between two worlds. Heat shimmers danced above the cracked earth, creating mirages that vanished the moment you tried to focus on them. This was land that had seen everything. Apache raids, Mexican revolutionaries, cattle drives, and border wars that left scars deeper than any plow could reach. Elena Vasquez stood on the front porch of the ranch house her grandmother had left. Watching the evening light paint the desert in shades of amber and rust. At 32, she carried herself with the straight-backed posture of someone who'd spent 8 years in the army, 4 of them deployed in places where staying alert meant staying alive. The Purple Heart in her dresser drawer told one story, but the quiet tension in her shoulders when thunder rolled across the valley told another. 6 months ago, she'd been Staff Sergeant Vasquez, leading convoy security missions through landscapes that looked remarkably similar to this stretch of South Texas. The desert had always called to something deep in her bones. But it wasn't until the roadside bomb outside Kandahar took most of her hearing in her left ear and all of her certainty about the future that she realized how much she needed the silence only wide-open spaces could provide. The inheritance had come at exactly the right time, though she'd never admit that to anyone. Abuela Rosa had been 93 when she passed, sharp as a tack until the very end, still riding her horse to check the water tanks well into her 80s. The will had been simple. The ranch went to Elena, the only grandchild who'd ever shown any interest in the stories the old woman used to tell about the land, about the history buried beneath decades of mesquite and prickly pear. What Elena hadn't expected was how broke the operation would be. The ranch covered nearly 2,000 acres of prime border country. But prime didn't mean profitable. The cattle operation barely covered the property taxes. The main house needed a new roof. The barn's foundation was settling, causing one whole wall to lean at an angle that defied physics. The well pump was held together with baling wire and prayers, and the fence line seemed to hemorrhage cattle faster than she could count them. Elena had arrived with her military discharge pay, a modest disability settlement that would last maybe 18 months if she was careful, and a determination to make something work. The nearest town, Esperanza, was 43 miles away, close enough for supplies, far enough that her nearest neighbor was a taciturn rancher named Miguel Santos, who ran cattle on the adjoining spread and communicated mostly in nods and hand gestures. The financial reality hit her within the first month. Her grandmother's ledger books, written in a combination of Spanish and English, with numbers that seemed to dance around the truth, painted a picture of a woman who'd been holding on to the land through sheer force of will and creative accounting. The mortgage payments alone ate up more than Elena's disability checks could cover. The bank in Esperanza had been patient with Rosa, but patience had limits, and those limits were fast approaching. Elena had spent her adult life following orders, moving when the army said move, deploying when deployment came, adapting to whatever mission needed doing. But this was different. This was choosing to stay when everything logical said to cut losses and run. This was choosing to fight for something that might already be lost. The house itself felt like a museum of a life fully lived. Rosa had been a pack rat with an eye for beauty. Hand-woven blankets draped every chair, photographs covered every surface, family gatherings, horses, cattle, visits from grandchildren who'd grown up and moved away to cities where the sky was smaller and the quiet less complete. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the corn tortillas Rosa had made fresh every morning for 70 years. Elena's favorite room was the study, where Rosa had kept her books and correspondence. The walls were lined with everything from veterinary manuals to volumes of Mexican poetry, from ranch financial records dating back to the 1940s to a collection of National Geographic magazines that chronicled decades of changing world. It was in this room that Elena spent her evenings, trying to make sense of numbers that stubbornly refused to add up to anything resembling solvency. The stories her grandmother had told seemed more real here, surrounded by the accumulated weight of a lifetime. Rosa used to speak of this land as if it held memories in its soil, as if the desert remembered every footstep, every campfire, every grave dug beneath the endless sky. She'd grown up hearing tales of Pancho Villa riding through these very canyons, of revolutionary armies moving like ghosts through the brush country, of treasure buried and lost and buried again. Elena had always assumed these were the embellished stories of an old woman who'd lived long enough to blur the line between history and legend. But Rosa had insisted the stories were true, passed down from her own grandmother, who'd been a young woman when Villa and his men had used this stretch of border country as a highway between Mexico and the safety of American territory. The financial pressure was constant, a weight that settled between Elena's shoulder blades and never quite lifted. She'd taken to checking the mail with the same kind of dread she'd once reserved for incoming mortar rounds. Bills arrived with mechanical regularity. The bank sent polite but increasingly firm letters about bringing the mortgage current. The county wanted property taxes that Elena had no idea how to pay. She considered selling, of course. A real estate agent from San Antonio had driven out to take a look, his city shoes gathering dust as he walked the property lines. The land itself was valuable, he'd explained. Development pressure from Austin and San Antonio was pushing deeper into the hill country. With the right marketing, the right buyer, she could walk away with enough money to start over somewhere else, maybe buy a small place closer to civilization. But every time Elena stood on the porch in the evening, watching the sun set over land that had been in her family for 4 generations, the idea of selling felt like betrayal, not just to Rosa's memory, but to something deeper. This land had shaped her grandmother, had given her the strength to raise 6 children as a widow, had provided the foundation for everything Elena herself had become. The military had taught her about different kinds of battles. Some you fought with weapons and tactics, others you fought with endurance and will. This felt like the second kind, a test of whether she could outlast circumstances that seemed determined to grind her down. The problem was that will didn't pay mortgage payments and endurance didn't fix leaking roofs. Elena had started taking odd jobs in town, helping other ranchers during branding season, driving a school bus route that took her through some of the most beautiful country in Texas, picking up part-time work at the feed store in Esperanza. Every dollar went toward keeping the ranch afloat, but it was like trying to fill a bathtub with a teaspoon while someone had left the drain open. The isolation was both blessing and curse. After years of living in close quarters with other soldiers, the solitude of the ranch felt like luxury. She could go days without speaking to another human being, moving through her work with only the cattle and the horses for company. But the quiet also amplified every small sound. The creak of the house settling, the distant howl of coyotes, the whisper of wind through the mesquite that sometimes sounded almost like voices. At night, when the work was done and the animals settled, Elena would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and feel the weight of all the decisions pressing down. Stay and likely lose everything anyway. Sell and have money but no home. Fight for something that might be impossible to save. Give up on the only place that had ever felt like it truly belonged to her. The ranch wasn't just land and buildings and livestock. It was the physical manifestation of her grandmother's entire life, the accumulated result of decades of small decisions and daily persistence. Rosa had survived the Depression, World War II, the death of her husband, economic downturns, droughts, floods, and all the countless small disasters that came with trying to make a living from the land. Elena would walk the fence lines in the early morning, checking for breaks, counting cattle, and trying to understand how her grandmother had made it work. The math never seemed to add up. The ranch had supported Rosa, had even provided enough for her to help her children get started in their own lives. But those children had moved away, had built careers in Houston and Dallas and Denver, had raised families who thought of the ranch as a nice place to visit but not as home. Now it was Elena's turn to figure out how to bridge the gap between what the land could provide and what survival required. She'd applied for agricultural grants, had looked into programs for veteran farmers, had explored every option the county extension agent could suggest. Some help was available, but not enough to solve the fundamental problem. The ranch needed significant investment to become truly profitable, and Elena had no capital to invest. The bank manager in Esperanza, a kind man named Robert Chen, who'd known Rosa for 30 years, had been as helpful as regulations allowed. He'd restructured the loan once, had given Elena time to get established, had even waived some fees. But banks had obligations to investors, and those obligations eventually trumped personal relationships. Elena understood. The military had taught her about institutional constraints, about how individual goodwill could only stretch so far before policy took over. But understanding didn't make the monthly payments any easier to manage, didn't make the roof leak any less when it rained, didn't make the future any more certain. She'd started making lists of what could be sold if selling became necessary. The antique furniture Rosa had collected over the decades, the small herd of registered quarter horses that were Elena's pride but were worth more than their practical value to the ranch operation. Some of the more remote parcels of land that didn't contribute much to the cattle operation but might appeal to hunters or developers. Each item on the list felt like a small amputation, a piece of her grandmother's legacy sacrificed to keep the core intact a little longer. But even selling everything that wasn't essential to basic operation wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. The ranch needed to generate more income, or Elena needed to find a different way to make a living while keeping the land. The weight of it all settled on her shoulders as she stood on the porch in the gathering darkness, watching the first stars appear in the vast Texas sky. Tomorrow would bring another day of the same calculations, the same careful management of dwindling resources, the same hope that somehow a solution would present itself. Elena had faced enemy fire, had made life and death decisions under pressure, had led soldiers through situations where failure wasn't an option. But this felt different, more personal, and somehow more difficult. In the military, the mission parameters were clear, the resources defined, the support structure reliable. Here, she was on her own with a mission that seemed to grow more impossible every day. Dawn broke over the Chihuahuan desert like a slow promise, painting the sky in layers of rose and gold that stretched from the Sierra Madre peaks in the south to the rolling hills that marked the edge of the Edwards Plateau. The air carried the sharp scent of creosote and sage, mixed with the earthier smell of cattle and the metallic tang that always seemed to hover near the Rio Grande. Elena stepped onto the porch with her first cup of coffee, breathing in the cool morning air that would be replaced by furnace heat within a few hours. The ranch house sat on a slight rise that gave views in every direction, south toward the river and Mexico, north toward the highway that connected Esperanza to the rest of Texas, east and west along the valley where generations of her family had run cattle and horses. From this vantage point, the land looked timeless, unchanged from the days when Comanche hunting parties had moved through these same draws and arroyos. But Elena knew the landscape held stories that weren't visible from the porch. Every arroyo had been carved by flash floods that could turn a dry creek bed into a raging torrent in minutes. Every grove of mesquite marked an old water source or the remains of some long-abandoned settlement. The desert looked empty to casual observers, but it was actually full of life adapted to harsh conditions. Roadrunners that could outrun most predators, javelinas that moved through the brush like grey ghosts, rattlesnakes that had learned to hunt in the cooling hours before dawn. The morning routine had become as regular as breathing. Check the horses in the near pasture, make sure the automatic waterers were functioning, count the cattle in the home section to ensure none had wandered. Through breaks in the fence during the night. The cattle were a mixed breed suited to the harsh country, mostly Black Angus crossed with Brahman, tough animals that could find food in terrain that would starve animals bred for gentler climates. Elena's favorite horse was a sorrel mare named Esperanza after the town, though Rosa had always insisted the horse was named for the concept rather than the place. Hope, she'd said, was something you needed more of than towns out here. The mare was getting older, moving with the careful precision of an animal that had learned to conserve energy for when it was truly needed. But she still had the sure-footed confidence that made her invaluable for working cattle in the rocky terrain. The barn was a testament to generations of practical problem-solving. The original structure dated to the 1920s, built from native limestone quarried from the ranch itself. Over the decades, additions had been made with whatever materials were available. Corrugated metal, concrete blocks, salvaged lumber from buildings torn down in town. The result was a patchwork building that looked like it had grown organically from the landscape, which in a sense it had. Inside the barn, Elena kept the tools that made the ranch operation possible. Hand tools mostly, though she'd inherited an ancient John Deere tractor that still ran despite having more hours on it than most commercial aircraft. The previous evening, she'd spent an hour replacing a hydraulic line on the tractor, working by the light of a trouble lamp while cicadas provided a soundtrack that rose and fell like electronic music. The repair work was both frustrating and satisfying. Elena had always been good with her hands, a skill that had served her well in the army, where soldiers were expected to maintain their own equipment under field conditions. But civilian repairs were different. In the military, when something broke, you either fixed it with available materials or called for replacement parts that would arrive within days. On the ranch, replacement parts cost money she didn't have, and shipping to Esperanza took time she couldn't spare. The day's work started before the sun cleared the eastern hills. Elena saddled Esperanza and rode out to check the south pasture, where a section of fence had been giving her problems. The wire was old, stretched beyond its useful life, and the cedar posts were showing signs of rot near the ground line. Every time a storm came through, she'd find new breaks where cattle had pushed through weakened sections. The fence line followed an old survey that dated to the 1880s, marked by stone cairns that had been built by surveyors who'd worked with chain and compass rather than GPS. Elena had found some of their original markers, roughly carved stones that bore dates and initials of men whose names were recorded in courthouse ledgers, but whose stories had been lost to time. The survey work had been dangerous in those days, with Apache raids still common and Mexican bandits operating freely on both sides of the border. Riding the fence gave Elena time to think, though thinking wasn't always productive when the thoughts kept circling back to the same insoluble problems. The mortgage payment was due in 2 weeks. The roof repair couldn't wait much longer, not with monsoon season approaching. The cattle needed vaccinations that would cost more than she'd made selling calves the previous month. Every solution she could think of required money she didn't have or time she couldn't spare. The landscape told stories of other people who'd faced similar challenges. Scattered throughout the ranch were the remains of earlier attempts at settlement, stone foundations of houses that had been abandoned during the Depression, overgrown corrals that marked the sites of line camps where cowboys had lived during roundup seasons, forgotten graves marked only by native stone, arranged in rough rectangles. Elena had explored many of these sites during her evening rides, trying to piece together the history of the land from the artifacts that remained. She'd found rusted horseshoes, broken pottery that might have been Mexican or might have been Apache, cartridge cases from rifles that hadn't been manufactured in decades. Each discovery added another layer to her understanding of the place, but understanding didn't solve present-day problems. The radio in her shirt pocket crackled with morning traffic from other ranchers in the area. Miguel Santos checking in with his foreman about moving cattle to fresh pasture. The Hendersons discussing a problem with their windmill. Tom Morrison asking if anyone had seen his missing bull, a breeding animal worth more than Elena's truck. The conversations were brief, practical, seasoned with the kind of humor that developed among people who shared common challenges. Elena rarely contributed to the radio chatter, preferring to listen and learn. These families had been working this country for generations. They knew which water sources were reliable during drought years, which sections of range provided the best winter grazing, which veterinarians would come out for emergency calls, and which ones insisted you bring animals to their clinics. It was knowledge accumulated over decades, passed down through families like recipes or songs. The morning sun climbed higher, bringing with it the heat that would define the rest of the day. Elena finished her fence inspection and turned Esperanza back toward the ranch house, following a cattle trail that wound through a grove of ancient live oaks. The trees provided welcome shade and marked one of the few reliable water sources on the property, a spring that had never gone dry in the memory of anyone still living. Rosa had told stories about this spring, about how it had sustained Native American camps, Mexican vaqueros, and finally the successive generations of her own family. The water was sweet and cold, filtered through limestone that removed the minerals that made well water in the area so hard. Elena often came here in the evening to let Esperanza drink and to enjoy the relative coolness the trees provided. The ruins of an old stone building sat near the spring, overgrown with vines and partially collapsed. Rosa had always been vague about the building's purpose, suggesting it might have been a way station for travelers or perhaps a hideout used by people who preferred not to be found. The construction was solid, built to last, with walls thick enough to provide shelter from both weather and hostile fire. Elena had spent several evenings exploring the ruins, clearing away vegetation to get a better sense of the original structure. It had been larger than it first appeared, with multiple rooms connected by narrow doorways. The roof had been flat, designed to shed the intense desert sun rather than heavy snow. Windows had been small and placed high, offering defensive advantages, while limiting exposure to the elements. Inside the ruins, Elena had found evidence of long occupation. Fire pits showed where multiple generations had cooked meals and warmed themselves during the brief but sometimes bitter desert winters. Niches in the walls had held oil lamps or stored personal belongings. The floor was packed earth-worn smooth by countless footsteps, and in places she could still see the remains of wooden planks that had once covered sections of the dirt floor. The spring itself emerged from a crack in the limestone cliff face, flowing year-round despite the desert climate. The water collected in a natural basin that had been enlarged and reinforced with carefully placed stones. A small channel carried overflow away from the spring, creating a narrow stream that provided water for wildlife before disappearing into the sandy soil a few hundred yards downstream. Elena had grown to think of this place as the heart of the ranch, the geographical and spiritual center that had drawn people for centuries. It was here that she came when the financial pressures felt overwhelming, when the isolation became too complete. when she needed to remember why she was fighting to keep the land. The spring represented permanence in a landscape where so much was temporary, continuity in a world where change often came too fast to process. The ride back to the house took her through terrain that showcased the full diversity of the Chihuahuan desert ecosystem. Flat sections of grassland where buffalo had once grazed gave way to rocky hills covered with lechuguilla and ocotillo. Dry arroyos cut deep channels through areas where sudden thunderstorms sent flash floods racing toward the Rio Grande. Each microhabitat supported its own community of plants and animals, creating a complex mosaic of life adapted to specific conditions. Elena had learned to read the landscape like a text, understanding what different plant communities indicated about soil conditions, water availability, and historical land use. Areas where prickly pear cactus dominated usually indicated overgrazing in the past. Dense stands of mesquite marked locations where cattle had congregated around water sources, spreading seeds through their droppings. Native bunch grasses survived in areas that had been protected from excessive grazing, creating islands of original prairie within the larger disturbed landscape. The knowledge was useful, but also humbling. Elena was beginning to understand how much she didn't know about managing this land sustainably. Her grandmother had possessed an intuitive understanding developed over 9 decades of observation and experience. Elena was trying to compress that learning into the few months she had before financial reality forced decisions she wasn't ready to make. Weather dominated everything in this country. Too little rain, and the grass wouldn't grow, forcing expensive supplemental feeding of the cattle. Too much rain at once, and the arroyos became temporary rivers that washed out fence lines and sometimes drowned livestock caught in the wrong place. The timing of precipitation mattered as much as the total amount. Early summer rains supported grass growth, while late summer storms often caused more erosion than benefit. Elena had inherited her grandmother's weather records, handwritten logs, that went back to the 1940s and documented every significant weather event. The data told stories of cycles within cycles, drought years that lasted half a decade, followed by periods when flooding was the primary concern. Successful ranching required planning for both extremes while hoping for the moderate conditions that allowed normal operations. The monsoon season was approaching, the time of year when afternoon thunderstorms built over the mountains and moved across the desert with dramatic displays of lightning and brief, intense downpours. Elena both anticipated and dreaded these storms. The rain was desperately needed for the summer grass, but the lightning and hail could cause damage that would cost more to repair than the benefit the moisture provided. As she approached the ranch house, Elena could see storm clouds beginning to build over the mountains to the west. The morning's clear skies were giving way to the unstable atmospheric conditions that characterize summer weather patterns in the desert. By afternoon, the air would be charged with electricity, and the decision of whether to bring the horses in or leave them in the pasture would depend on reading subtle signs in the cloud formations. The approaching weather felt like a metaphor for everything else in Elena's life, full of potential for both renewal and destruction, impossible to control but essential to navigate skillfully. Like the financial pressures, like the isolation, like the weight of family history, the weather was simply another variable in an equation that grew more complex every day. But for now, the morning was still cool. Esperanza moved beneath her, with the easy rhythm of a horse that knew this country intimately, and the problems that would demand attention by evening could wait a few more hours. In the desert, Eleanor was learning, you took peace when you could find it, because it never lasted as long as you hoped. The storm arrived 3 days later with the sudden violence that characterized summer weather in the borderlands. Elena had spent the morning moving cattle to higher ground, reading the signs in the building clouds that promised more than the usual afternoon shower. The air pressure dropped so quickly she could feel it in her ears, and the horses grew restless, in a way that spoke of atmospheric electricity building beyond the visible horizon. By early afternoon, the western sky had turned the color of old pewter, shot through with veins of yellow-green that meant hail was forming somewhere in the towering thunderheads. Elena finished securing loose equipment around the barn and brought the horses into the covered stalls, though Esperanza kept turning toward the open door as if she could see something in the approaching weather that humans couldn't detect. The first drops fell like scattered coins on the metal roof of the barn, each impact distinct and metallic. Within minutes, the scattered drops became a steady drumming, then a roar that made conversation impossible. Elena stood in the barn doorway, watching sheets of rain sweep across the desert, transforming the landscape into something primordial and wild. Lightning began as distant flickers, then moved closer until the thunder followed each flash by only seconds. The storm was moving fast, driven by winds that bent the mesquite trees nearly horizontal and sent tumbleweeds cartwheeling across the flats like oversized insects fleeing disaster. Elena had experienced artillery barrages that were less intense than this display of natural force. The rain fell so hard it seemed to bounce back up from the ground, creating a fog of moisture that limited visibility to a few dozen yards. Elena watched from the safety of the barn as rivulets formed in the yard, then streams, then torrents that carved temporary channels in the packed earth. The sound was overwhelming. Rain on metal roofing, water rushing through the gutters that couldn't handle the volume, the crash of thunder that seemed to shake the ground itself. When the lightning moved directly overhead, Elena retreated deeper into the barn. The horses stood quietly in their stalls, ears forward but calm, as if they understood this was simply something to be endured rather than fought. Elena envied their acceptance. Her human brain wanted to analyze, to prepare, to somehow take action. But there was nothing to do but wait for the storm to pass. The hail began 20 minutes into the downpour, starting as pea-sized pellets that mixed with the rain, then growing to marble-sized stones that struck the roof with the sound of machine gunfire. Elena watched through the barn door as ice balls the size of golf balls began bouncing in the yard, accumulating in drifts against the fence posts and water troughs. The storm's fury peaked when a bolt of lightning struck somewhere close enough that the thunder was instantaneous, a crack that seemed to split the air itself. The lights in the barn flickered and went out, leaving Elena in the grey twilight created by the storm clouds. Emergency battery-powered radio chattered with reports from other ranches. Trees down, power lines broken, flash flood warnings for all the low-water crossings between the ranch and town. As suddenly as it had begun, the storm moved on. The rain diminished from a roar to a steady patter to scattered drops. The thunder grew more distant. The pressure in Elena's ears equalized, and she could hear individual sounds again, water dripping from the eaves, a cow bawling somewhere in the distance, the horses moving restlessly in their stalls. Elena stepped outside into air that had been washed clean and cooled by 20 degrees. The smell was indescribable, desert sage mixed with wet earth, ozone from the lightning, and something else that might have been the scent of growing things responding to moisture. Steam rose from the metal roofing as the sun broke through the departing clouds. The immediate damage was obvious, but not catastrophic. Hail had stripped leaves from some of the smaller trees and plants, leaving the yard littered with green debris. A section of the old wooden fence near the house had blown down, though the posts were still standing. One of the barn's gutters had pulled loose and hung at an angle, but the roof itself appeared intact. Elena walked around the buildings, assessing what would need immediate attention and what could wait. The power was out, which meant no well pump until the electric cooperative could restore service. The phone line was dead, though that might be a problem anywhere between the ranch and the switching station in town. The road to the highway would need to be checked for washouts before she could drive to town for supplies. It was while walking around the house that Elena noticed something different about the old stone foundation at the north end of the building. The foundation dated to the original construction in the 1920s, built from limestone blocks quarried on the ranch itself. Over the decades, earth had accumulated against the stones, and vines had covered much of the original masonry. The storm's runoff had carved a channel along the foundation, washing away years of accumulated soil and debris. Where the water had scoured deepest, Elena could see that one of the foundation stones had shifted, leaving a gap that hadn't been visible before the storm. The stone was large, probably weighing several hundred pounds, and the gap behind it looked like it might extend further into the foundation than normal construction would require. Elena knelt beside the exposed stone, running her fingers along the edges where mortar had been washed away. The craftsmanship was excellent, with stones fitted so precisely that mortar was barely visible in most joints. But this particular stone was different. The mortar around its edges was a different color, slightly newer, as if it had been removed and reset at some point after the original construction. Curiosity overrode the practical need to check fence lines and count cattle. Elena went to the barn and returned with a pry bar and a heavy hammer. The stone was loose enough that she could work the pry bar into the gap the storm had opened. Leverage was everything with stones this size, and Elena had learned about leverage in demolition training. Though she'd never expected to use those skills on her grandmother's house, the stone moved more easily than she'd expected, rocking outward as she applied pressure with the pry bar. Behind it was not solid earth or more foundation stones, but darkness. Elena used the flashlight from her truck to peer into the gap, and the beam revealed what appeared to be a hollow space extending back into the foundation. Working carefully to avoid bringing more stones down on herself, Elena managed to remove enough of the displaced stone to create an opening large enough to crawl through. The space behind the foundation was man-made, carved from the limestone bedrock and reinforced with carefully fitted stones. It was a room, or at least a large chamber, hidden beneath the north end of the house. Elena's first thought was that she'd discovered a root cellar or storm shelter that had been forgotten over the decades. Many old houses in this part of Texas had underground storage areas designed to stay cool in summer and provide protection from tornadoes. But, as she explored the space with her flashlight, it became clear that this chamber had been designed for concealment rather than storage. The entrance was deliberately hidden, with no exterior access. The chamber itself was dry, with drainage channels carved into the floor to carry away any moisture that might seep through the stone walls. Most tellingly, the walls showed tool marks that suggested hurried construction, as if the space had been excavated and finished quickly by people who couldn't afford to take their time. Elena squeezed through the opening and found herself in a room roughly 8 feet square and tall, enough to stand upright. The walls were lined with stone shelves, and the floor was paved with flat limestone slabs fitted together with the same precision as the foundation walls above. The air was cool and dry, with no trace of the musty smell she'd expected from an underground space. On the shelves, wrapped in oiled canvas and leather, were objects that clearly didn't belong to any normal household storage. Elena's flashlight beam revealed what appeared to be weapons, rifle barrels and wooden stocks carefully separated and wrapped, ammunition in boxes that bore markings she didn't recognize, and other items wrapped too thoroughly to identify without unwrapping them. But it was the wooden chest in the far corner that captured Elena's attention. It was substantial, built from heavy planks reinforced with iron strapping, with a locking mechanism that looked more like something from a bank vault than a household storage container. The wood was dark with age, but showed no signs of rot or insect damage, suggesting it had been built to preserve its contents indefinitely. Elena approached the chest carefully, her military training making her cautious about disturbing anything that had been hidden this deliberately. The lock was substantial, but showed signs of corrosion around the edges. More importantly, it appeared to be unlocked, as if whoever had placed the chest here had intended it to be opened by someone who... He found it. The lid was heavy, requiring Elena's full strength to lift it on hinges that protested with the sound of metal that hadn't moved in decades. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be silk cloth, were items that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. Gold coins, their surfaces gleaming despite their obvious age. Silver ingots stamped with marks that looked Mexican. Jewelry that appeared to be crafted from precious metals and stones. But it was the papers that made Elena realize she'd stumbled into something far more significant than a hidden cache of valuable items. Maps drawn on heavy paper, showing routes through the border country with notes written in Spanish, letters bearing signatures she couldn't make out in the dim light. And most remarkably, what appeared to be a journal written in a strong, confident hand that filled page after page, with entries dated from 1915 to 1919. Elena sat back on her heels, flashlight in one hand and journal in the other, trying to process what she was seeing. The dates corresponded to the height of the Mexican Revolution, when Pancho Villa and other revolutionary leaders had used the border country as a highway between Mexico and the sanctuary of American territory. The maps showed routes that included landmarks Elena recognized from her own rides around the ranch. The handwriting in the journal was clear enough to read, though the Spanish required Elena to work slowly through passages that described movements of men and supplies, payments made and received, and plans for operations that extended on both sides of the international border. One name appeared repeatedly, Villa, written with the familiarity of someone who knew the man personally rather than just by reputation. Elena found herself holding what appeared to be a first-hand account of revolutionary activities written by someone who had been directly involved in Villa's operations. More than that, the contents of the chest suggested this had been a significant storage location for revolutionary funds and supplies, hidden in a place where Mexican authorities couldn't reach and American authorities were unlikely to look. The search implications were staggering. Elena was sitting in a room that had apparently served as a revolutionary safe house, holding documents and treasure that had been hidden for over a century. The ranch land she'd inherited wasn't just valuable for cattle and horses, it was the site of a historically significant cache that could potentially be worth millions of dollars. But as Elena sat in the hidden chamber surrounded by artifacts, from one of the most turbulent periods in Mexican history, she felt more overwhelmed than excited. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. How had her grandmother's family become involved with Villa's forces? Had they been active participants in the revolution or simply people caught up in events beyond their control? And perhaps, most importantly, what was Elena supposed to do with this knowledge? The storm had passed completely now, and late afternoon sunlight was beginning to filter through the opening Elena had created in the foundation. She needed to secure the chamber and decide how to proceed, but first she needed to document what she'd found. The military had taught her the importance of documentation, especially when dealing with potentially sensitive materials. Elena carefully photographed the contents of the chest with her phone, making sure to capture the journal pages that mentioned Villa by name and the maps that showed routes through the ranch property. The gold and silver would need professional evaluation to determine their historical significance and current value, but even Elena's untrained eye could see that the collection was substantial. As she prepared to leave the chamber, Elena noticed something else that had been hidden in the shadows behind the chest. A rifle, wrapped in oiled cloth, like the other weapons but stored separately. When she unwrapped it carefully, she found herself holding what appeared to be a Winchester rifle, with engravings on the stock and barrel that suggested it had belonged to someone of importance. The rifle was in remarkable condition, protected by the dry air and careful wrapping. But it was the silver plate inlaid in the stock that made Elena's hands tremble slightly. Engraved in ornate script were the words Francisco Villa and a date from 1916. Elena was holding what appeared to be Pancho Villa's personal weapon, hidden in a chamber beneath her grandmother's house for over a century. The weight of the discovery settled on Elena like a physical presence. She was no longer just a struggling rancher trying to make mortgage payments. She was the custodian of a historically significant site and a collection of artifacts that belonged in museums. The financial problems that had seemed so insurmountable an hour ago suddenly seemed trivial compared to the responsibility of deciding what to do with a piece of Mexican revolutionary history. Elena secured the chamber as best she could, replacing the stone, but leaving it loose enough that she could access the space again. The storm had revealed a secret that changed everything about the ranch, but it had also created a burden of decision that she wasn't prepared to carry alone. The sun was setting over land that had just become infinitely more complex than it had been that morning. Elena spent the first sleepless night walking circles around the house, her mind racing between disbelief and a growing sense of urgency she couldn't quite name. Every few hours, she found herself returning to the hidden chamber, shining her flashlight on the contents to confirm they were real. The gold coins gleamed back at her with the patient persistence of metal that had waited a century to be discovered. The journal pages, when she could force herself to focus long enough to read them, painted a picture of revolutionary activities that made her small corner of Texas feel like the center of a much larger historical drama. By dawn, Elena had made several decisions, though she wasn't sure any of them were correct. First, she needed to understand exactly what she'd found before telling anyone else about the discovery. Second, she needed to research the legal implications of possessing what appeared to be historically significant artifacts. Third, she needed to figure out how this discovery might solve her immediate financial problems without compromising whatever historical value the collection might have. The practical challenges started immediately. The storm had knocked out phone and internet service, leaving Elena isolated from the outside world at precisely the moment when she most needed access to information. The county road was washed out, in 3 places between the ranch and the highway, meaning she couldn't drive to town even if she wanted to. Miguel Santos's radio chatter suggested that power restoration would take at least several days, and telephone service often took longer than electricity to restore after major storms. Elena found herself in the strange position of possessing what might be a fortune while being unable to contact anyone who might help her understand its significance or value. She spent the morning trying to read more of the journal by natural light, working slowly through Spanish that was formal and sometimes archaic, different from the colloquial border Spanish she'd grown up hearing. The journal entries revealed a complex network of support for Villa's forces that extended throughout the border region. Elena's ranch appeared to have been just one of many safe houses where revolutionary fighters could rest, resupply, and hide weapons and funds. The entries described payments to local families, arrangements for moving wounded fighters to safety, and preparations for raids that would be launched from American territory against Mexican government forces. What struck Elena most forcefully was the matter-of-fact tone of the entries. Whoever had written the journal treated revolutionary activities as routine business, recording transactions and movements with the same attention to detail that Elena's grandmother had used to track cattle sales and feed purchases. The revolution had been these people's daily reality, not the romantic adventure that later historians and filmmakers had made it seem. Elena began to understand why the chamber had been built with such care and concealed so thoroughly. Possession of revolutionary materials could have meant death for entire families if the wrong authorities had discovered them. The cache represented not just financial resources, but evidence of activities that could have destroyed everyone connected with them if exposed at the wrong time. The weather remained unsettled, with afternoon thunderstorms that kept Elena close to the buildings and made outdoor work impossible. She used the forced indoor time to continue exploring the journal and to examine the other documents more carefully. Some of the maps were hand-drawn, showing routes through the desert that avoided military patrols and custom stations. Others appeared to be official Mexican government documents, though Elena couldn't determine whether they had been stolen or provided by sympathetic officials. The monetary value of the collection was impossible for Elena to estimate accurately, but even her limited knowledge suggested it was substantial. The gold coins appeared to be Mexican pesos from the Porfiriato period, when Mexico had been on the gold standard. The silver ingots bore stamps that might indicate their purity and weight. The jewelry included pieces that appeared to incorporate precious stones along with the gold and silver settings. But Elena was beginning to realize that the historical value might far exceed the monetary worth of the precious metals. Primary source documents from Villa's forces were rare, particularly detailed journals that covered extended periods. Museums and universities would likely consider such materials priceless for their research value, regardless of their composition. The rifle presented its own category of significance. If it was indeed Villa's personal weapon, it would be one of the most important artifacts from the Mexican Revolution in private hands. Elena had seen enough military museums to know that weapons with verified historical provenance could be worth millions of dollars, particularly when they belonged to figures as legendary as Pancho Villa. Elena's military experience had included some exposure to the legal complexities surrounding historical artifacts, particularly items that might have been removed from their countries of origin during periods of conflict. The laws governing such materials were intricate and varied, depending on how the items had been acquired, when they had crossed international boundaries, and what treaties had been in effect at different times. The isolation that had seemed like a curse when Elena was struggling with mortgage payments now felt like a blessing that gave her time to think without external pressure. She needed to make careful decisions about how to proceed, and rushing into contact with authorities or potential buyers could create complications that might be impossible to resolve later. Elena began methodically photographing and cataloging everything in the chamber, creating a record that would document the collection's condition and contents regardless of what happened next. She used her phone to take detailed photos of individual journal pages, map sections, and each piece of precious metal and jewelry. The work was slow and methodical, requiring careful handling of materials that were fragile despite their remarkable preservation. The documentation process revealed details that hadn't been visible during her initial exploration. Some of the journal entries included sketches of people and places, providing visual context for the written descriptions. Margin notes in different handwriting suggested that multiple people had used the journal, perhaps adding information or corrections as events unfolded. Dates and locations could be cross-referenced with known historical events, potentially allowing verification of the journal's authenticity. Elena found herself becoming absorbed in the historical detective work, trying to piece together the story of how these materials had ended up hidden beneath her grandmother's house. Family stories began to take on new significance as Elena remembered fragments of Rosa's tales about the old days, about visitors who had come and gone without explanation, about times when the family had hidden in the root cellar while armed. Men rode past the house, The stories had always seemed like the embellished memories of an old woman who had lived through dramatic times. Now Elena wondered if Rosa had been more literally accurate than anyone had realized. Perhaps the bandits and revolutionaries Rosa had described weren't folklore characters, but real people who had used the ranch as a way station during their operations. Elena's great-great-grandmother would have been a young woman during the revolution, old enough to make decisions about whether to help Villa's forces and how to conceal evidence of that assistance. The timing matched the journal entries, and the geographical details in the maps corresponded to landmarks Elena recognized from her rides around the ranch property. As the afternoon thunderstorm built over the western mountains, Elena sat in the hidden chamber reading by flashlight, trying to decipher entries that described preparations for what appeared to be a major operation. The dates suggested it might have been related to Villa's raid on Columbus, New Mexico in 1916, one of the few times revolutionary forces had actually attacked targets on American soil. The entries became more urgent as the dates approached March 1916, with references to gathering supplies, coordinating with other groups, and moving large amounts of money and weapons. Elena found herself reading a first-hand account of the planning for one of the most significant border incidents in American history, written by someone who had been directly involved in the preparations. The historical significance of what she was reading began to overshadow even the potential financial value of the precious metals. Elena was holding documents that could rewrite academic understanding of Villa's operations, providing details that historians had only been able to speculate about. Universities would compete for access to materials this detailed and comprehensive. But the weight of that significance was also overwhelming. Elena was a struggling rancher, not a historian or museum curator. She had no training in the proper preservation of historical documents, no understanding of the legal frameworks that might govern their ownership, and no connections to the academic or museum communities that would need to evaluate their authenticity and importance. The storm outside intensified, with lightning close enough that Elena could feel the static electricity raising the hair on her arms. She secured the journal carefully in its wrappings and prepared to leave the chamber until the weather passed. The irony wasn't lost on her that another storm had revealed the cache, and now storms were interrupting her efforts to understand what she'd found. Elena climbed out of the chamber and replaced the loose stone, though she no longer bothered to try to conceal the entrance completely. The secret had been kept for over a century, but that era was ending. Soon she would need to make decisions about how to proceed, and those decisions would determine not just her own future, but the fate of historically significant materials that belonged to more than just her. The financial pressures that had seemed so urgent before the discovery now felt abstract and distant. Elena still needed to make mortgage payments and repair the roof, but those problems seemed trivial compared to the responsibility of properly handling artifacts that could reshape understanding of the Mexican Revolution. The ranch was no longer just her inheritance. It was a historically significant site that carried obligations extending far beyond her personal financial situation. Elena spent the evening in Rosa's study, surrounded by the books and papers that documented her grandmother's long life, looking for any additional clues about the hidden chamber and its contents. Rosa had been a meticulous record keeper, but her files contained no obvious references to revolutionary activities or hidden treasures. If Rosa had known about the cache, she had carried that knowledge to her grave without leaving any written record. But Elena began to notice subtle patterns in her grandmother's behavior that took on new meaning in light of the discovery. Rosa had always been protective of the ranch's history, discouraging Elena from exploring certain areas and deflecting questions about some of the family stories. Rosa had also been remarkably knowledgeable about Mexican history, particularly the revolutionary period. though she had always attributed her knowledge to general interest rather than family involvement. Most tellingly, Rosa had been adamant that the ranch should stay in the family, even when selling it would have provided financial security for her old age. Elena had assumed this was simple attachment to the land, but now she wondered if Rosa had been protecting something more specific than sentimental value. Elena fell asleep in Rosa's chair, surrounded by papers and photographs that might contain additional clues about the chamber and its contents. Her dreams were filled with images of armed riders moving through the desert darkness, of her ancestors making life-and-death decisions about whom to trust and what risks to take, of secrets being buried in stone chambers that would wait a century for the right storm to reveal them. She woke before dawn with a clarity about her next steps that had been missing during the confused hours immediately after the discovery. Elena needed expert help to understand what she'd found, but she needed to choose her experts carefully. The wrong person could complicate the situation beyond repair, while the right advisors could help her navigate the complex legal and historical issues while preserving the integrity of the find. The power was still out, but Elena could see vehicle lights on the county road, suggesting that at least some of the washouts had been repaired overnight. Soon she would be able to drive to town, make phone calls, and begin the process of turning her accidental discovery into a managed situation. The isolation that had given her time to think was ending, and the next phase of dealing with Villa's treasure was about to begin. The first memory came unbidden, while Elena stood in the early morning light, coffee cooling in her hands as she stared at the foundation stone she'd replaced but hadn't sealed. She was 8 years old, spending a summer at the ranch, following Rosa around like a devoted shadow. They had been walking past the old stone building near the spring when Elena had asked about the ruins, and Rosa had grown suddenly quiet. Her weathered hands working the rosary beads she always carried. "Some places hold secrets, Mija," Rosa had said finally, her voice carrying a weight that 8-year-old Elena hadn't understood. "Sometimes, keeping those secrets safe is more important than understanding them." Rosa had steered them away from the ruins that day, but not before Elena had seen her grandmother glance back with an expression that seemed part sadness, part fierce protectiveness. Now, 30 years later, Elena wondered if Rosa had been talking about more than old stones and foundations. The memory felt like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed, revealing connections that had been hidden in plain sight throughout her childhood. How many of Rosa's seemingly casual stories about the old days had actually been carefully edited versions of much more dramatic truths? Elena forced herself through the morning routine of checking livestock and equipment, but her mind kept returning to fragments of conversations and half-remembered stories that now carried different meanings. Rosa had always known exactly where to find water during drought years, claiming her grandmother had taught her about secret springs. Rosa had spoken Spanish with visitors in a formal, almost ceremonial way that suggested deeper cultural connections than Elena had realized. Rosa had possessed an uncanny ability to predict when Border Patrol vehicles would be patrolling the area, always managing to arrange her activities to avoid unwanted attention. The cattle were restless, sensing Elena's distraction in the way. That animals always seemed to detect human emotional states. Esperanza stood at the pasture gate with her ears forward, watching Elena with the patient attention of a horse that knew something had changed in her human's behavior. Even the ranch dogs seemed more alert than usual, as if they understood that normal routines had been disrupted by forces beyond their comprehension. Elena found herself riding the fence lines with new eyes, seeing the landscape not just as grazing land, but as terrain that had sheltered revolutionary movements and hidden treasure for over a century. Every arroyo could have provided cover for armed riders moving by night. Every grove of trees could have served as a meeting place or temporary camp. Every water source would have been known to Villa's men as they moved through country that was simultaneously foreign and familiar. The spring where Elena often rode in the evenings took on particular significance when viewed through this historical lens. It was perfectly positioned to provide water for travelers moving parallel to the Rio Grande, while staying far enough from the river to avoid Mexican military patrols. The ruined stone building would have offered shelter and defensive positions for people who needed to disappear quickly if authorities approached. Elena dismounted at the spring and walked through the ruins with the methodical attention she'd once used to clear buildings in Afghanistan. The military had taught her to read constructed spaces for signs of their original purpose, and now she was seeing details that had escaped her notice during casual visits. The walls weren't just thick, they were designed to deflect incoming fire. The window openings provided clear fields of fire in multiple directions. The interior layout included defensive positions that would allow a small force to hold off a much larger attacking group. But it was the carefully concealed entrance Elena found in the cliff face behind the spring that made her breath catch. Hidden by vegetation and almost invisible unless approached from exactly the right angle, a narrow opening led into what appeared to be a natural cave that had been enlarged and modified for human use. Elena had passed this spot dozens of times without noticing the entrance, but now she could see tool marks where the opening had been carefully enlarged to allow passage while remaining hidden from casual observation. The cave extended much deeper into the cliff than Elena had expected, with passages that connected multiple chambers carved from the limestone. Her flashlight beam revealed evidence of long occupation: fire pits, sleeping areas, storage niches, carved into the walls, and even a system of channels that directed water from the spring through the cave complex. This hadn't been a temporary hideout, but a carefully prepared safe house designed to shelter significant numbers of people for extended periods. In the deepest chamber, Elena found something that made her sink to her knees in amazement. Carved into the stone wall, in letters that had been filled with some kind of dark pigment, were the words "Villa's Army" and dates that spanned from 1915 to 1918. Below the inscription were names, dozens of them, carved by people who had wanted to leave some record of their presence in this hidden place. Elena traced the carved letters with her fingertips, feeling the connection to people who had used the same tools and techniques she'd learned in the military, but for a revolution that had ended before her grandparents were born. These weren't just historical artifacts. They were messages from people who had faced life and death situations in the same terrain where Elena now lived and worked. The names included some that Elena recognized from her grandmother's stories, though Rosa had always presented them as family friends rather than revolutionary fighters. Others were completely unfamiliar, but the careful way they had been carved suggested that each name represented someone important enough to the group that their presence here deserved permanent commemoration. Elena photographed everything in the cave, documenting the inscriptions and the evidence of occupation with the same methodical approach she'd used to catalogue the contents of the hidden chamber beneath the house. But she also found herself simply sitting in the silence of the cave, trying to imagine what it had been like for the people who had sheltered here during the chaos of the revolutionary period. The cave would have been completely dark except for the small fires they could risk. The silence would have been broken by whispered conversations in Spanish and the constant awareness that discovery could mean death for everyone present. These people had been part of a movement that was reshaping an entire nation, but in moments like this, they would have been simply human beings trying to stay alive in a hostile environment. Elena's phone showed no signal in the cave, cutting her off from the outside world, as completely as Villa's fighters had been isolated during their stays here. The experience was both unsettling and oddly peaceful, removing the constant background awareness of obligations and communications that defined modern life. For the first time since discovering the treasure, Elena felt like she could think clearly about what the discovery meant and what she should do next. The financial implications were becoming clearer as Elena understood the full scope of what she'd inherited. The treasure in the hidden chamber was just one part of a historically significant site that included multiple structures and a cave complex that had played a role in the Mexican Revolution. Universities and museums would compete for the opportunity to study the site. Tourism authorities would see it as a potential destination that could bring visitors and revenue to the region. Government agencies would want to inventory and potentially claim materials that might be considered cultural patrimony. But Elena was also beginning to understand why Rosa had never revealed the existence of these materials. Once their existence became public knowledge, Elena would lose control over how they were studied, displayed, and interpreted. The ranch would become a destination for researchers, tourists, and treasure hunters. The privacy and isolation that made the place special would be destroyed by the very discoveries that could make Elena financially secure. The irony was profound. Elena had been struggling to find ways to make the ranch profitable enough to keep, and now she'd discovered assets that could solve her financial problems permanently. But exploiting those assets would fundamentally change the character of the place she was trying to preserve. The ranch would survive, but it would no longer be the quiet refuge that had drawn Elena back to her family's land. Elena climbed out of the cave as the afternoon heat was building, emerging into sunlight that seemed almost harsh after the cool darkness underground. Esperanza was waiting patiently where Elena had left her, though the mare's ears were forward and alert, suggesting she'd been monitoring sounds and movements that Elena hadn't detected from inside the cave. The ride back to the house took Elena past landmarks that now carried double meanings. Every water tank and windmill marked locations that would have been crucial to revolutionary forces moving through the area. Every section of fence followed property lines that had been established. During the period when Villa's army was operating in the region, every view toward Mexico revealed terrain that had witnessed some of the most dramatic events in North American history. Elena began to understand that her inheritance included not just land and buildings and livestock, but responsibility for preserving and interpreting a piece of history that belonged to more than just her family. The decisions she made about the treasure and the cave complex would affect how future generations understood the Mexican Revolution and its impact on border communities. The weight of that responsibility was both inspiring and terrifying. Elena had been trained to make decisions under pressure, but military decisions typically involved clearly defined objectives and established protocols. This situation required her to balance competing interests: historical preservation, financial necessity, family loyalty, and legal compliance, without any clear guidance about which considerations should take priority. Elena spent the evening in Rosa's study again, but this time she was looking for different kinds of information. Instead of searching for direct references to the treasure or the cave, she was trying to understand her grandmother's values and priorities. What had mattered most to Rosa? How had she balanced the competing demands of financial survival and historical preservation? What would Rosa want Elena to do with the knowledge that had been passed down through 4 generations of careful secrecy? The answer came from an unexpected source. In a box of Rosa's personal papers, Elena found a letter her grandmother had written but never sent, dated just 6 months before her death. The letter was addressed to Elena and contained Rosa's thoughts about the ranch and its future. Most of the letter dealt with practical matters, advice about managing cattle, suggestions for maintaining the buildings, warnings about which neighbors could be trusted and which couldn't. But the final paragraph contained a message that seemed to speak directly to Elena's current situation. Some things are more valuable than money, mija. The land remembers everything that has happened on it, but it only tells its secrets to people who love it enough to protect them. If you ever find something that others would want to take from you, remember that keeping it safe might be more important than making it profitable. Our family has been the guardians of this place for 4 generations. That's a responsibility that comes with privileges, but also with obligations that go beyond our own needs. Elena read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning. Rosa had known about the treasure and the cave. She had chosen not to reveal their existence during her lifetime, trusting that Elena would make the right decisions. When the time came, the storm that had exposed the hidden chamber hadn't been an accident. It had been the mechanism Rosa had trusted to reveal the family's secrets when Elena was ready to handle them responsibly. The realization that Rosa had planned this discovery changed everything about how Elena understood her situation. She wasn't just an accidental inheritor of revolutionary treasure. She was the latest in a line of guardians who had protected these materials for over a century. Rosa had tested Elena's commitment to the ranch by leaving her with financial pressures that could only be resolved by someone who truly valued the land for more than its economic potential. Elena had passed that test by choosing to fight for the ranch, despite the financial difficulties. Now she was being trusted with knowledge that could transform her life, but only if she could figure out how to honor both her own needs and her obligations to the historical materials she'd inherited. The decision about what to do with Villa's treasure would define not just Elena's future, but her worthiness to carry on a family tradition that had preserved one of the most significant archaeological sites on the Texas-Mexico border. As Elena prepared for another restless night, she knew that the time for solitary decision-making was ending. Tomorrow, she would need to begin reaching out to experts who could help her understand the legal and historical implications of her discovery. But tonight, she would spend one more evening as the sole keeper of secrets that had been waiting over a century to be revealed. Elena's first call went to Dr. Carmen Rodriguez at UT Austin, a historian whose research on the Mexican Revolution had earned national recognition. Elena had found her name in Rosa's correspondence, a brief exchange from years earlier when Dr. Rodriguez had been researching border communities and their role in revolutionary activities. The conversation was difficult to navigate, requiring Elena to describe her discovery without revealing too much about its scope or location. "I've found some documents that might be from the Villa period," Elena said carefully, using the desk phone in Rosa's study. The connection was scratchy, but clear enough for conversation. Family papers that were hidden during the revolution and forgotten until now. Dr. Rodriguez's interest was immediate and intense. "Revolutionary period documents are extremely rare in private hands," she said. "Most were destroyed or seized during the various government crackdowns. What kind of materials are we talking about?" Elena had rehearsed this part of the conversation, trying to provide enough information to establish credibility without revealing details that might attract unwanted attention. Journals, maps, correspondence, some dating to 1915 and 1916. There are also some artifacts that might have historical significance. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Elena wondered if the connection had been lost. When Dr. Rodriguez spoke again, her voice carried a different tone, more careful and professional. "Ms. Vasquez, if these materials are authentic, they could be incredibly valuable for historical research. But I need to warn you that the legal Situations surrounding such artifacts can be extremely complex. Elena felt her stomach tighten. What kind of legal issues? Items that crossed the border during the revolutionary period might be subject to cultural patrimony laws, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Both the Mexican and American governments have claims on materials they consider part of their national heritage. Additionally, if the items were acquired through activities that were illegal at the time, even if those activities are now viewed as legitimate political resistance, there could be complications regarding ownership and possession. Elena had expected legal complexities, but hearing them articulated by an expert made them feel more immediate and threatening. What would you recommend as a first step? Documentation, Dr. Rodriguez said without hesitation. Detailed photographs and descriptions of everything you've found. Chain of custody information showing how the materials came into your family's possession. Any supporting evidence that establishes authenticity and provenance. But Elena, and I hope you don't mind me using your first name, you need to be very careful about who you trust with this information. Elena spent the rest of the morning making similar calls to other experts whose names she'd found in Rosa's papers or through online research. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. Initial excitement followed by warnings about legal complications and advice to proceed cautiously. Elena began to understand that her discovery existed in a gray area where historical significance, legal ownership, and national interests intersected in ways that could create as many problems as opportunities. The most sobering conversation was with James Mitchell, a lawyer who specialized in antiquities and cultural property law. Mitchell had handled cases involving everything from Native American artifacts to artwork looted during World War II, and his assessment of Elena's situation was blunt and discouraging. "You're essentially asking me to help you navigate a minefield," Mitchell said after Elena had described her discovery in general terms. Mexican revolutionary materials are subject to multiple overlapping legal frameworks. The Mexican government considers anything connected to national heroes like Villa to be cultural patrimony that belongs to the Mexican people, regardless of where it's currently located. The U.S. government has various laws about importing cultural materials and harboring items that might have been acquired illegally. Elena listened with growing dread as Mitchell outlined the potential complications. Even if your family acquired these materials legally at the time, changes in international law over the past century might affect their current legal status. And that's assuming you can prove legal acquisition, which is often impossible with items that were hidden during periods of political upheaval. "So what are my options?" Elena asked. "Honestly, the safest approach might be to contact the appropriate authorities and arrange for the materials to be turned over to institutions that can properly preserve and study them. You might be eligible for finder's fees or tax deductions, but trying to maintain private ownership could expose you to both civil lawsuits and criminal charges." Elena thanked Mitchell for his time and hung up feeling more confused than when she'd started. Every expert she'd contacted had emphasized the historical importance of her discovery, but none had offered a clear path forward that would allow her to benefit financially while meeting her legal obligations. The treasure that had seemed like a solution to her problems was beginning to feel like a burden that could destroy her life if handled incorrectly. Elena spent the afternoon in the hidden chamber, examining the materials with new eyes informed by the morning's conversations. The gold and silver were beautiful, but Elena now understood that their monetary value was secondary to their historical significance. The journal entries that had seemed like fascinating glimpses into the past were actually primary source documents that could reshape academic understanding of the Mexican Revolution, but it was the rifle that most clearly illustrated the complexity of her situation. If it was indeed Villa's personal weapon, It was probably one of the most historically significant firearms in private hands anywhere in the world. Museums would compete for the opportunity to display it. Collectors would offer enormous sums. To acquire it, the Mexican government would almost certainly claim it as a national treasure that belonged in Mexico, regardless of how it had come to be hidden in Texas. Elena found herself caught between competing emotions. Pride in her family's role in protecting these materials warred with anxiety about the legal and financial risks they represented. Excitement about the historical significance of the discovery competed with resentment that her grandmother had left her to navigate these complexities without guidance or preparation. The isolation of the ranch, which had seemed like a blessing, when Elena was trying to process the discovery privately, now felt like a limitation that prevented her from getting the expert advice she needed. Every phone conversation required her to trust strangers with information that could have enormous consequences if it reached the wrong people. Every expert she contacted increased the number of people who knew about the discovery, making it harder to control how the information spread. Elena began to understand why Rosa had chosen to keep the materials hidden throughout her lifetime. The complications surrounding their ownership and legal status were overwhelming, even with modern communication technology and legal resources. During Rosa's youth, when anti-Mexican sentiment was common and revolutionary activities were treated as criminal behavior, revealing the cache could have resulted in the loss of the ranch and imprisonment for the entire family. But Elena also realized that the world had changed in ways that might work to her advantage. The Mexican Revolution was now viewed as a legitimate struggle for social justice rather than criminal banditry. Villa himself was recognized as a complex, historical figure rather than simply a bandit who had attacked American territory. Academic and public interest in border history had increased dramatically, creating potential audiences for responsibly managed revelations about the revolutionary period. Elena's research into potential buyers and institutions revealed a market for revolutionary materials that was both substantial and legally complex. Private collectors were willing to pay enormous sums for authenticated Villa artifacts, but many such transactions occurred in legal gray areas. Museums and universities had more limited budgets, but offered legitimacy and proper preservation. Government institutions could provide legal protection, but might also impose restrictions that would limit Elena's financial benefit. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor that complicated Elena's planning even further. Miguel Santos, her neighbor, rode up to the house on his best horse, dressed in the clean jeans and pressed shirt he reserved for important occasions. Elena had been expecting this visit since word of the storm damage had spread through the local ranching community, but she wasn't prepared for the intensity of Miguel's interest in her recent activities. "Elena," Miguel said after the usual pleasantries about weather and cattle, "people are talking about you spending a lot of time around the old stone foundation. Some folks are wondering if maybe you found something interesting after the storm." Elena felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her expression neutral. "Just checking for damage. The storm washed out a lot of soil around the house foundation." Miguel nodded, but his eyes remained focused on Elena's face in a way that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "You know, my grandfather used to tell stories about that old house. Said there were rumors about things being hidden there during the revolution. Of course, he also said the desert was full of buried treasure, so nobody took him too seriously." The conversation felt like a chess match, where Elena couldn't see all the pieces on the board. Miguel was clearly fishing for information, but she couldn't determine whether his interest was casual curiosity, neighborly concern, or something more calculating. Elena had learned in the military that the best way to handle such situations was to acknowledge the obvious while revealing nothing significant. There are a lot of stories about buried treasure in this part of the country, Elena said. Probably most of them are just wishful thinking by people who want to believe their land is worth more than cattle prices would suggest. Miguel laughed, but the sound didn't reach his eyes. Probably so. But if you ever did find something interesting, you'd want to be careful about who you told. There are people who make their living tracking down rumors about valuable items. Not all of them are as honest as they should be. Elena thanked Miguel for the advice and watched him ride away, wondering how much he actually knew about the ranch's history. His grandfather would have been alive during the revolutionary period, old enough to remember events that other people only knew through stories. Miguel's warning about dishonest treasure hunters suggested that Elena's discovery might not be as secret as she'd hoped. The conversation with Miguel crystallized Elena's growing understanding that she was running out of time to make decisions. Privately, word was already spreading through the local community that something unusual was happening at the ranch. Soon she would be dealing with visitors, questions, and attention that would make careful planning impossible. Elena spent the evening reviewing the notes she'd taken during her conversations with experts, trying to identify a path forward that would balance her various obligations and interests. The legal advice had been uniformly cautious, emphasizing the risks of maintaining private ownership of the materials. The historical advice had stressed the importance of proper documentation and authentication. The financial advice had suggested that the monetary value of the collection could solve Elena's immediate problems while creating new ones. But it was Rosa's unfinished letter that provided the clearest guidance for Elena's decision-making. Her grandmother had understood that preserving the materials was more important than profiting from them. But she had also recognized that Elena would need financial resources to maintain the ranch and continue serving as guardian of its secrets. The challenge was finding a way to honor both obligations simultaneously. Elena began drafting plans that would allow her to reveal the discovery gradually, controlling the flow of information to minimize legal risks while maximizing the historical and financial benefits. She would start by contacting a small number of trusted experts who could help authenticate the materials and establish their provenance. She would document everything meticulously, creating a record that would support her family's ownership claims while demonstrating responsible stewardship of the historical materials. Most importantly, Elena would maintain control over access to the site and materials, ensuring that any study or display of the collection would respect both its historical significance and her family's role in preserving it. The treasure that Villa's forces had hidden over a century ago would finally be revealed, but on terms that honored both the revolutionary fighters who had created the cache and the family that had protected it through 4 generations of careful secrecy. As Elena prepared for what might be her last night as the sole keeper of Villa's secret, she felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. Tomorrow would begin the process of transforming a private family inheritance into a public historical resource. The decision she made in the coming days would determine whether that transformation preserved or destroyed the values that had motivated her family's century-long guardianship of one of the most significant archaeological sites on the Texas-Mexico border. Elena drove the winding road to Esperanza for the first time since the storm, watching familiar landmarks emerge through the heat shimmer rising from cracked asphalt. The town hadn't changed much in the 3 days since the storm, but Elena felt like she was seeing everything through different eyes. The old courthouse, where Revolutionary-era records might be stored. The library, where microfilm of historical newspapers could contain forgotten references to Villa's activities in the area. The radio tower that connected this isolated community to the wider world, where experts and authorities waited to learn about her discovery. The First National Bank of Esperanza occupied a limestone building that had been constructed during the 1920s, when cotton farming and cattle ranching had brought enough prosperity to justify grand architecture in small towns. Elena parked in front of the building and sat for a moment, gathering courage for a conversation that would mark the beginning of the end of her family's century-long secret. Robert Chen, the bank president, had been patient with her financial struggles, but Elena was about to test that patience in ways that neither of them could have anticipated. Chen's office was decorated with photographs of local ranching families dating back 3 generations, including several pictures that featured Rosa during her younger years. Elena had always found comfort in those images, proof that her grandmother had been a respected member of the community long before Elena had arrived to claim her inheritance. Now those same photographs felt like evidence of the deep roots that would either protect Elena's interests or complicate her efforts to maintain control over the discovery. "Elena," Chen said, rising from behind a desk covered with loan documents and agricultural reports. "Good to see you made it through the storm without major damage. Miguel Santos mentioned you'd been doing some repair work around the foundation." Elena felt a familiar spike of anxiety at the confirmation that her activities were being discussed throughout the community. Small-town communication networks operated with an efficiency that could be either supportive or invasive, depending on circumstances. Elena was beginning to understand that her circumstances were definitively in the latter category. "Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about," Elena said, settling into the chair across from Chen's desk. "The storm exposed some things that I need professional advice about. Historical materials that might affect the ranch's value, and my legal obligations." Chen's expression shifted from casual interest to focused attention. As a banker who had spent 30 years evaluating the financial implications of unexpected discoveries, he understood that Elena was describing a situation that could fundamentally alter their existing relationship. What kind of historical materials? Elena had rehearsed this conversation during the drive to town, but the words still felt inadequate to describe the magnitude of what she'd found. Documents and artifacts from the Mexican Revolution period, items that might have belonged to Pancho Villa and his forces. They were hidden in a chamber beneath the house, and the storm damaged the concealment enough that I was able to discover them. The silence that followed Elena's revelation stretched long enough that she could hear the air conditioning cycling on and the distant sound of traffic on the highway that connected Esperanza to the rest of Texas. Chen was clearly processing the implications of what she'd told him, and Elena could almost see him calculating the potential impact on the loan that secured her ranch against default. "Elena," Chen said finally, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a banker who had learned to avoid showing emotion during important negotiations. "If what you're describing is authentic, it could change everything about your financial situation. But it could also create complications that might be more difficult to resolve than your current mortgage problems." Elena appreciated Chen's directness, even as his words confirmed her own fears about the legal and financial maze she was entering. "I'm trying to figure out how to handle this responsibly. I don't want to make decisions that could hurt the ranch or put me in legal jeopardy, but I also can't ignore the potential value of what I've found." Chen leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in the gesture Elena had learned to recognize as his thinking pose. "Have you contacted any experts about authentication and valuation?" "Several. Historians, lawyers, appraisers. Everyone agrees that the materials could be extremely valuable, but they also warn about legal complications involving cultural patrimony laws and international treaties governing historical artifacts." "And what do the experts recommend?" Elena had been dreading this question, because the expert advice had been uniformly cautious to the point of being discouraging. Most of them suggest turning the materials over to institutions that can properly study and preserve them. I might be eligible for finder's fees or tax benefits, but maintaining private ownership could expose me to legal risks that might outweigh any financial benefits. Chen nodded slowly, and Elena could see him shifting into the professional mode that had made him successful in banking, despite the challenges of serving a rural community with limited resources. Elena, I'm going to be completely honest with you. If these materials are as significant as you believe, you're going to need help from people with more expertise than I can provide. But I can tell you that your current financial situation gives you very little room for error. Elena felt her stomach tighten as Chen pulled out the file containing her loan documents. She knew the numbers by heart, but seeing them spread across Chen's desk made them feel more immediate and threatening. The mortgage payments she'd been struggling to make seemed trivial compared to the legal fees she might face if the discovery created the complications that experts had warned about. However, Chen continued, if you can establish clear legal ownership of the materials and find a way to monetize them appropriately, your financial problems would obviously be resolved. The question is whether you can navigate the legal and historical issues without losing control of the discovery or exposing yourself to risks that could cost you the ranch regardless of the treasure's value. Elena left the bank with more questions than answers, but also with Chen's commitment to provide additional time for loan payments while she explored her options. The conversation had confirmed her growing understanding that the discovery was too significant to handle alone, but it had also reinforced her determination to maintain control over how the materials were revealed and studied. Elena's next stop was the Esperanza Public Library, a small building that housed one of the most comprehensive collections of local historical materials in South Texas. The head librarian, Margaret Thompson, had known Rosa for decades and had helped Elena with research about the ranch's history during her first months as owner. If anyone in town might have additional information about the Revolutionary period, it would be Margaret. Elena, dear, Margaret said, looking up from a cart of books she was shelving in the local history section. I heard you had some storm damage out at the ranch. Are you finding everything you need for repairs? Elena had decided to be more open with Margaret than she'd been with Chen, partly because librarians were professionally committed to preserving information rather than exploiting it for financial gain. Actually, the storm revealed some things that I'm trying to research, historical materials that might date to the Mexican Revolution period. Margaret's eyes brightened with the enthusiasm Elena had learned to associate with people who truly cared about preserving local history. How exciting! What kind of materials? Documents, maps, some artifacts that might have belonged to Villa's forces. I'm trying to understand the legal and historical context before I decide how to proceed. Margaret set down the books she'd been shelving and motioned for Elena to follow her to a reading table surrounded by filing cabinets and reference materials. You know, your grandmother and I used to talk about the Revolutionary period quite a bit. Rosa always seemed to know more about those events than she was willing to discuss publicly. Elena felt a familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension as she realized that Margaret might possess information that could help her understand Rosa's role in preserving the hidden materials. What kind of things did she talk about? Margaret pulled several boxes of files from a nearby cabinet, each labeled with dates from the 1910s and 1920s. Rosa used to bring me oral histories that she'd collected from older family members and neighbors, stories about the revolution that weren't recorded in official documents. Some of them mentioned hidden materials and safe houses, but Rosa always insisted they were just family legends rather than factual accounts. Elena helped Margaret spread the contents of the boxes across the reading table, revealing handwritten accounts, photographs, and newspaper clippings that documented the revolutionary period from the perspective of border communities that had experienced the events firsthand. Many of the documents contained information that Elena recognized from the journal entries she'd found in the hidden chamber. "This is fascinating," Elena said, studying a photograph that showed armed men on horseback, in terrain that looked remarkably similar to her ranch property. "Do you know where this was taken?" Margaret examined the photograph carefully, then pointed to a notation on the back, written in Rosa's distinctive handwriting. "According to your grandmother, this was taken somewhere in the area that's now your ranch." She said her grandmother had hidden the photograph during a government raid in the early 1920s, when authorities were trying to confiscate anything connected to revolutionary activities. Elena felt pieces of a historical puzzle clicking into place as she realized that the library's collection contained documentation that could help authenticate the materials she'd discovered. Rosa had been systematically preserving evidence of the ranch's role in the revolution, but she'd kept the most significant materials hidden while depositing supporting documentation in the library, where it would be preserved but not immediately recognized for its significance. Margaret continued pulling items from the files, each one adding to Elena's understanding of the ranch's historical importance. Maps that showed the location of safe houses and supply routes, letters from family members describing visits from Villa's men, even receipts for supplies that had been purchased to support revolutionary activities. "Margaret," Elena said, studying a letter that contained references to materials being hidden for safekeeping during government raids. "Did Rosa ever say anything specific about whether these stories were based on factual events?" Margaret paused. In her sorting of documents, and Elena could see her making decisions about how much to reveal. "Your grandmother made me promise never to discuss certain things while she was alive. But since she's passed on, and since you're asking as the current owner of the ranch, I think she would want you to know the truth." Elena felt her pulse quicken as Margaret pulled a sealed envelope from the bottom of one of the boxes. Elena's name was written on the front in Rosa's handwriting, with instructions that the envelope should be given to Elena only after she had begun asking specific questions about the ranch's revolutionary history. "Rosa left this for you about a year before she died," Margaret said, handing Elena the envelope. "She said you would know when the time was right to read it." Elena opened the envelope with trembling hands, revealing a letter that was longer and more detailed than the one she'd found in Rosa's personal papers. This letter contained specific information about the hidden chamber, the cave complex, and the historical significance of the materials that had been preserved there. But more importantly, it contained Rosa's instructions for how Elena should handle the discovery when the time came to reveal it. "The materials you will find are more than treasure," Rosa had written. "They are evidence of our family's role in one of the most important movements in Mexican history, but they also represent obligations that extend beyond our own interests. The people who hid these items trusted our family to protect them until they could be revealed safely and honorably. You must find a way to honor both their trust and your own needs." Elena read the letter twice, absorbing instructions that were both specific and flexible enough to allow for circumstances Rosa couldn't have anticipated. Elena was to document everything carefully, contact experts who could verify authenticity, and seek legal advice about ownership rights. But she was also to maintain family control over the discovery process, ensuring that any revelation of the materials would credit her family's role in their preservation. Most importantly, Rosa had arranged for the library's historical collection to serve as supporting documentation for Elena's claims about the material's provenance and significance. The oral histories, photographs and documents that Margaret had been preserving would provide the context necessary to authenticate Elena's discovery and establish her family's legal right to possess the materials. Elena left the library with copies of relevant documents and Margaret's commitment to provide additional research support as needed. The visit had transformed Elena's understanding of her situation from accidental discovery to planned revelation, from legal risk to historical opportunity. Rosa had spent decades preparing for this moment, building a foundation of documentation and professional relationships that would support Elena's efforts to handle the discovery responsibly. Elena's final stop in town was the office of Patricia Morales, the only lawyer in Esperanza who specialized in property law and cultural issues affecting the border region. Elena had met Morales briefly during the process of settling Rosa's estate, but she hadn't anticipated needing her services for anything more complex than standard ranch legal matters. Morales listened carefully as Elena described her discovery and outlined the expert advice she'd received about potential legal complications. Unlike the experts Elena had contacted by phone, Morales was familiar with local legal precedents and the specific political dynamics that affected cross-border cultural issues in South Texas. Elena, Morales said after reviewing the documentation, Elena had brought from the library, "You're in a much stronger legal position than you realize. The materials were found on property that has been in your family for 4 generations. You have documentation establishing their presence there since at least the 1920s. Most importantly, you have evidence showing that your family preserved these materials during periods when possession could have resulted in serious legal consequences." Elena felt a cautious optimism beginning to replace the anxiety that had dominated her thoughts since the discovery. "What would you recommend as next steps?" Morales outlined a strategy that balanced historical authenticity with legal protection, financial opportunity with cultural responsibility. Elena would work with a carefully selected team of experts to document and authenticate the materials while maintaining control over the revelation process. Legal ownership would be established through documentation of family custody and historical context. Financial benefits would be pursued through partnerships with institutions rather than private sales to collectors. The key, Morales explained, is to position yourself as the responsible steward of historically significant materials, rather than as someone trying to profit from accidental discovery. Your family's century-long preservation of these items gives you moral and legal authority that treasure hunters and opportunistic collectors can't claim. Elena drove back to the ranch as the sun was setting over terrain that had witnessed some of the most dramatic events in North American history. The consultations in town had transformed her understanding of the discovery from overwhelming burden to manageable opportunity. Rosa's careful preparation had provided Elena with the resources and relationships necessary to navigate the legal and historical complexities while maintaining family control over the process. Tomorrow, Elena would begin implementing the strategy that would gradually reveal Villa's treasure to the world while preserving the values that had motivated her family's guardianship for over a century. The secret that had been hidden beneath the desert for generations was finally ready to be shared, but on terms that honored both the revolutionary fighters who had created the cache and the family that had protected it through decades of careful silence. 3 months after the initial discovery, Elena stood in what had once been Rosa's study, now transformed into a coordination center for the most carefully managed archaeological revelation in Texas history. Maps covered every wall, marked with GPS coordinates for the chamber, the cave complex, and 3 additional cache sites that ground-penetrating radar had revealed. Computer screens displayed real-time feeds from security cameras positioned around the ranch perimeter, File cabinets contained hundreds of pages of authentication reports, legal documents, and correspondence with institutions from around the world. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Elena had spent weeks implementing Patricia Morales' strategy, building a team of experts who could verify the material's authenticity while respecting her family's role in their preservation. Dr. Rodriguez had become the lead historian, coordinating with colleagues at universities in both the United States and Mexico. James Mitchell had agreed to serve as legal counsel, navigating the complex international regulations governing cultural artifacts. Margaret Thompson had become the project's archivist, ensuring that every document and photograph was properly preserved and catalogued. But the most crucial team member was someone Elena had never expected to work with, Dr. Alejandra Villa Hernandez, great-granddaughter of Pancho Villa himself, who had emerged from academic obscurity to authenticate materials that had belonged to her legendary ancestor. The irony wasn't lost on Elena that Villa's own descendant would play a key role in revealing the treasure that his forces had hidden over a century earlier. Dr. Villa Hernandez had arrived at the ranch 2 weeks earlier, traveling from Mexico City with credentials from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico and letters of introduction from government officials who had authorized her participation in the authentication process. Elena had been nervous about meeting someone with such a direct connection to the revolutionary leader, but Villa Hernandez had proved to be a pragmatic academic more interested in historical accuracy than family legend. "Your rifle is authentic," Villa Hernandez had announced after examining the weapon with equipment that could analyze metal composition and manufacturing techniques. The silver inlay work matches other examples of presentation weapons that were commissioned for my great-grandfather during the height of his power. More importantly, the wear patterns and modifications are consistent with heavy field use by someone who carried the weapon personally rather than keeping it for ceremonial purposes. The authentication of the rifle had opened doors that Elena couldn't have imagined when she'd first discovered the hidden chamber. The Smithsonian Institution had expressed interest in a temporary exhibition that would display the weapon alongside other Villa artifacts from their permanent collection. The Mexican National Museum had proposed a cultural exchange that would allow Mexican citizens to view their national heritage while acknowledging the role that border families had played in preserving it. But Elena had been most surprised by the interest from Hollywood producers who wanted to create a documentary about the discovery. The story had everything that modern audiences craved: hidden treasure, family secrets, historical mystery, and a strong female protagonist who had overcome financial adversity to become the guardian of priceless artifacts. Elena had turned down 3 separate offers for film rights, but she was beginning to understand that the media attention was inevitable and needed to be managed rather than avoided. The financial implications of the discovery had exceeded even Elena's most optimistic projections. Conservative estimates valued the precious metals at over $2 million, but the historical significance of the collection had attracted offers that were substantially higher. The rifle alone had been appraised at $12 million by Sotheby's, though Elena had no intention of selling it to private collectors who might remove it from public access. Instead, Elena had negotiated partnerships with institutions that would allow the materials to be displayed and studied while maintaining her family's ownership and control. The University of Texas had agreed to house the collection in a climate-controlled facility that would be built specifically for Villa-related artifacts. The Mexican government had provided guarantees that the materials would be treated as legitimate cultural heritage rather than stolen property, acknowledging the role that border families had played in preserving revolutionary history. Most importantly for Elena's immediate situation, the partnerships included substantial payments that would secure the ranch's financial future permanently. The university was paying $2 million for 50-year exhibition rights to the collection. The documentary producers had agreed to a licensing fee that would cover all of Elena's debts and provide operating capital for ranch improvements. Tourism revenues from visitors who wanted to see the discovery site were projected to generate ongoing income that would make the ranch operation profitable for the first time in decades. But success had brought complications that Elena was still learning to navigate. The ranch had become a destination for historians, journalists, treasure hunters, and curiosity seekers who arrived daily hoping to glimpse the site where Villa's treasure had been hidden. Elena had been forced to hire security guards and install gates to control access to the property. The isolation that had once defined ranch life had been replaced by constant activity that required careful management to prevent chaos. Elena had also discovered that managing historically significant materials required skills that her military training hadn't provided. Every decision about conservation, display, and access had to balance competing interests from institutions that viewed the collection from different perspectives. Academic historians wanted unlimited research access. Museum professionals insisted on environmental controls that would preserve the materials indefinitely. Government officials demanded guarantees that cultural protocols would be respected in any public presentation of the artifacts. The legal framework that Patricia Morales had established was holding up under scrutiny from multiple jurisdictions, but Elena was constantly signing documents and attending meetings with officials who needed assurance that the discovery was being handled appropriately. The Mexican consul in San Antonio had visited twice to inspect the materials and verify that they were being treated with proper respect. FBI agents specializing in art and antiquities had conducted interviews to ensure that Elena wasn't involved in any illegal trafficking of cultural materials. Elena's relationship with her neighbors had evolved in ways that reflected the community's mixed feelings about the attention the discovery had brought to their quiet corner of Texas. Miguel Santos had proved to be surprisingly supportive, helping Elena manage the increased traffic on county roads and providing advice about dealing with unwanted visitors. Other neighbors were less enthusiastic about the transformation of their rural community into a destination for outsiders who didn't understand local customs and priorities. The most difficult adjustment had been Elena's loss of privacy. Reporters had researched her military service and published profiles that described her transition from combat veteran to guardian of historical treasures. Photography of the ranch had appeared in magazines and newspapers around the world. Elena's phone number had somehow been obtained by collectors and researchers who called at all hours seeking information about the discovery or proposing deals for access to the materials. Elena had been forced to hire an assistant to manage communications and coordinate the activities of researchers and visitors. Maria Gonzalez, a recent graduate from the University of Texas with degrees in history and museum studies, had become indispensable for handling the administrative complexity that accompanied the project. Maria spoke fluent Spanish and English, understood both Mexican and American cultural sensitivities, and possessed the diplomatic skills necessary to manage competing demands from institutions and individuals who wanted access to the collection. But, despite the complications, Elena was beginning to understand that the discovery had fulfilled Rosa's vision for preserving the family's historical legacy while securing its financial future. The ranch would continue to be owned and operated by Elena's family, but it would also serve as a guardian of materials that belonged to the broader history of the borderlands. Future generations would inherit not just land and livestock, but responsibility for maintaining one of the most significant archaeological sites related to the Mexican Revolution. Elena had established a foundation that would ensure permanent funding for conservation and research activities related to the collection. The foundation's board included family members, academic historians, and community representatives who would make decisions about access and interpretation that balanced scholarly needs with family interests. Revenue from exhibitions, licensing, and tourism would support both the foundation's activities and the ranch's ongoing operations. The cave complex had proved to be even more historically significant than the hidden chamber beneath the house. Archaeological surveys had revealed evidence of occupation spanning centuries, from pre-Columbian Native American settlements through the Revolutionary period and beyond. The inscriptions that Elena had found during her initial exploration were part of a larger record that documented the movements and activities of Villa's forces throughout the border region. Dr. Rodriguez was coordinating with colleagues in Mexico to develop a comprehensive study of the site that would place Elena's discovery in the context of revolutionary activities throughout the borderlands. The research would take years to complete, but preliminary findings suggested that Elena's ranch had served as a central coordination point for Villa's operations in Texas, making it one of the most important revolutionary sites north of the Rio Grande. Elena had insisted that any academic study of the site must include acknowledgement of her family's role in preserving the materials and maintaining the integrity of the historical record. Too often, she had learned, academic institutions appropriated discoveries made by private individuals without crediting the people who had made preservation possible. Elena's contracts with researchers included specific requirements for recognizing family contributions to the historical record. The international attention that the discovery had generated was creating opportunities that Elena was still learning to evaluate. The Mexican government had invited her to speak at conferences about border history and cultural preservation. American universities were offering her positions as a lecturer or consultant on projects related to revolutionary history. Publishers wanted her to write books about the discovery and her family's role in preserving the materials. Elena was particularly interested in educational opportunities that would help other people understand the complexity of border history and the importance of preserving cultural materials. Too many people viewed the borderlands as a place where dramatic events had happened to other people, without understanding that families like Elena's had been active participants in shaping the region's history. Elena wanted to use her platform to highlight the contributions of border communities to both Mexican and American historical narratives. The success of the discovery had also created opportunities for Elena to support other families who might be guardians of historical materials they were afraid to reveal. Elena had established a confidential consulting service that would help people navigate the legal and institutional frameworks necessary to reveal family collections responsibly. The service was already receiving inquiries from families throughout the Southwest who possessed materials they believed might have historical significance. As Elena stood in the transformed study, reviewing reports from the day's activities, she felt the weight of responsibilities that extended far beyond her original goal of saving the ranch from foreclosure. The discovery had made her a public figure with obligations to academic institutions, government agencies, and communities on both sides of the border who viewed the collection as part of their heritage. But Elena had also gained something she hadn't expected: a deeper understanding of her own place in the history of the borderlands. The materials that Villa's forces had hidden over a century earlier had been preserved by 4 generations of women who had understood that some things were worth protecting, regardless of the personal cost. Elena was continuing that tradition, But she was also expanding it to include broader communities who deserved access to their own historical legacy. The evening routine now included security checks and coordination with researchers who would be working on the site the following day. Elena walked the fence lines with new purpose, protecting not just cattle and horses, but archaeological sites that were being studied by experts from around the world. The land that had once seemed like a burden too expensive to maintain had become a responsibility too important to abandon. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from Maria, confirming the next day's schedule of interviews with reporters from Mexico City who were documenting the discovery for a television program about revolutionary history. Elena smiled as she realized that tomorrow she would be explaining her family's century-long guardianship to an audience that included descendants of the very people who had originally hidden the treasure she was now revealing to the world. 6 months later, Elena stood at the podium of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, looking out at an audience that included diplomats, historians, and descendants of revolutionary families from both sides of the border. Behind her, displayed, in climate-controlled cases that cost more than most people's houses, were the artifacts that had transformed her life and reshaped understanding of the Mexican Revolution. Villa's rifle gleamed under carefully calibrated lighting, surrounded by maps, journal pages, and photographs that told the story of a movement that had touched communities thousands of miles from the battlefields where history books claimed the revolution had been fought. When my grandmother Rosa died, Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the museum's acoustics, she left me more than a ranch. She left me a responsibility that I didn't understand until a storm revealed. Secrets that had been hidden for over a century. Today, I want to share not just the story of what we found, but what it taught me about the families who preserve history without recognition, who guard treasures without reward, who understand that some things are more valuable than the price they might bring. In the front row, Dr. Villa Hernandez nodded encouragingly. Beside her sat Margaret Thompson, who had flown to Washington to see the culmination of decades of careful preservation work. Miguel Santos had driven his first airplane. Uncomfortable in the suit Elena had insisted he buy for the occasion, but proud to represent the community that had supported the discovery process. Patricia Morales was taking notes for the legal proceedings that would establish precedents for future discoveries of cultural materials. Elena clicked to the first slide of her presentation, a photograph of the ranch taken the morning after the storm that had changed everything. This is what the desert looks like when it decides to give up its secrets, but the desert didn't choose the timing randomly. My family had been preparing for this revelation for 4 generations, preserving documentation, building relationships, and waiting for the right moment to share what they had protected. The presentation that followed wove together personal narrative with historical analysis, family stories with archaeological evidence, individual sacrifice with community benefit. Elena described the painstaking process of authentication, the legal complexities of establishing ownership, and the diplomatic negotiations that had resulted in the international cooperation now governing the collection's study and display. But it was when Elena reached the final section of her presentation that the audience leaned forward with renewed attention. The Villa collection was just the beginning, Elena announced, advancing to a slide that showed the broader archaeological survey of the ranch property. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed 17 additional cache sites scattered across our land. Each one contains materials that add to our understanding of how revolutionary movements operated and how border communities supported activities that were reshaping an entire nation. Elena had been saving this revelation for maximum impact, and the audience's reaction confirmed its significance. Historians who had spent careers studying the revolution with limited primary source materials were learning that Elena's ranch contained enough artifacts to rewrite textbooks. Government officials who had negotiated the original agreements were realizing they would need to expand international cooperation to handle discoveries that dwarfed the initial find. But here's what I've learned that's even more important than the historical value of what we've found, Elena continued, advancing to a slide that showed a map of the American Southwest, marked with dozens of locations where similar discoveries might be waiting. My family isn't unique. Throughout the borderlands, there are families who have preserved materials they've been afraid to reveal, who know stories they've been afraid to tell, who guard secrets that could transform our understanding of how this region's history really unfolded. Elena described the consulting service she had established to help other families navigate the process of revealing historical materials responsibly. In just 6 months, the service had been contacted by families in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California who possessed everything from Revolutionary-era weapons to Native American artifacts to documents related to early Spanish exploration. Each family faced the same dilemma Elena had confronted: how to honor their role as guardians of history while protecting themselves from legal and financial risks. The Villa collection has generated enough revenue to establish a permanent foundation that will help families throughout the Southwest reveal their historical materials safely and profitably, Elena announced. We're creating a model that protects family ownership while ensuring scholarly access, that provides financial benefits while maintaining cultural authenticity, that honors the past while building sustainable futures for the communities that have preserved our history. Elena's presentation concluded with a video tour of the ranch that showed the cave complex, the hidden chamber, and the ongoing archaeological work that was revealing new discoveries almost daily. But the final image was a photograph of Elena, standing with a group of local children who were participating in an educational program that taught border history through hands-on interaction with the artifacts their own family's land had preserved. These children are growing up understanding that they live in a place where history happened, where their ancestors made decisions that affected the course of nations, where the ground beneath their feet holds stories that belong to all of us. Elena said, "That's the real treasure we've uncovered, not just gold and silver and historically significant artifacts, but the knowledge that ordinary families in extraordinary times can preserve legacies that survive for generations." The applause that followed Elena's presentation lasted nearly 5 minutes, but it was the conversations that developed afterward that confirmed the discovery's broader impact. Embassy officials discussed cultural exchange programs that would allow Mexican students to study their revolutionary heritage in American institutions. University administrators proposed research partnerships that would bring international scholars to study borderlands history in the communities where it had actually unfolded. Museum directors outlined exhibition plans that would travel the Villa collection to institutions throughout North America. Elena found herself surrounded by people who wanted to discuss collaboration, partnership, and expansion of the model she had developed for handling family-owned historical materials. But it was the conversation with a young woman from New Mexico that reminded Elena why the broader implications of her discovery mattered more than its immediate benefits. "My great-grandmother left us some things that might be from the territorial period," the woman said quietly, glancing around to ensure. Their conversation remained private. "Old papers, some jewelry, weapons that have been hidden in our house for as long as anyone can remember. But we've been afraid to tell anyone because we don't know what the legal implications might be, and we can't afford lawyers or experts to help us figure it out." Elena handed the woman a business card for the consulting service, along with her personal phone number. "Call me next week. We'll help you understand what you have and how to handle it properly. No one should have to choose between preserving their family's history and protecting their financial security. 3 months later, Elena was back at the ranch, but the quiet isolation that had once defined her daily routine had been replaced by controlled activity that balanced preservation with access, research with respect, discovery with responsibility. The Foundation's offices occupied a new building constructed with traditional materials that blended into the desert landscape. Researchers from universities around the world worked in climate-controlled laboratories that allowed detailed study of artifacts while protecting them from environmental damage. But the most significant change was evident in the broader community. Esperanza had grown from a struggling rural town to a destination for cultural tourism that was generating jobs and revenue throughout the region. Hotels, restaurants, and gift shops had opened to serve visitors who came to learn about revolutionary history. Local families were being hired as guides and interpreters, sharing stories that had been passed down through generations but never before valued as educational resources. Elena's morning routine now included checking email from families throughout the Southwest, who were working with the Foundation to reveal their own historical materials. Each success story validated the model she had developed, proving that families could maintain ownership and control of their heritage while contributing to broader understanding of regional history. As Elena stood on the porch of the house where her grandmother had preserved secrets for 93 years, watching the sunrise over land that had witnessed some of the most dramatic events in North American history, she felt the satisfaction of someone who had honored both personal obligations and public responsibilities. The storm that had revealed Villa's treasure had been the beginning of a transformation that extended far beyond her own financial security. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Rodriguez, confirming the arrival of a delegation from Spain who wanted to study connections between Villa's revolution and earlier independence movements. Elena smiled as she realized that tomorrow she would be explaining how a small ranch in South Texas had become a center for international research into the history of democratic movements throughout the Americas. The treasure that Pancho Villa's forces had hidden over a century earlier had finally been revealed, but not in the way Elena had initially imagined. Instead of solving her problems by providing quick financial relief, the discovery had created opportunities that were transforming not just Elena's life, but the entire understanding of how border communities had shaped the history of two nations. Elena walked toward the barn where Esperanza was waiting for their morning ride, thinking about the children who would grow up understanding that their families were guardians of history, about the scholars who would spend careers studying materials that had been preserved by ordinary people in extraordinary times, about the communities that would benefit from tourism revenue generated by their own cultural heritage. Some stories end with discovery. Others begin there. Elena's story had become part of the continuing narrative of the borderlands, where families like hers would continue preserving history that belonged to everyone while maintaining the values that had made preservation possible. Across generations of careful guardianship, thank you for joining Elena on this incredible journey from financial struggle to historical discovery, from isolation to international recognition, from personal crisis to community transformation. If Elena's story reminded you that ordinary people can preserve extraordinary legacies, please like this video. And if you believe, like we do, that every family's history matters and every secret has its perfect moment to be revealed, subscribe to our channel, because some treasures are worth waiting a century to find, but even more worth sharing when the time is right.